She was selling cookies to pay for chemotherapy, but no one was stopping until Will Smith showed up at her table. What happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of the city, a mix of car exhaust, street food, and the faint, salty tang of the ocean. The sky stretched above, painted in shades of soft orange and dusky pink as the sun slowly dipped behind the skyline. Neon signs flickered to life along the streets, their colors reflecting off the windows of passing cars. The distant hum of traffic blended with scattered conversations, occasional bursts of laughter, and the rhythmic strumming of a street musician's guitar somewhere down the block. Ulysses Grant Park was just a few blocks away, a spot where people gathered to walk their dogs, jog, or simply sit on the benches and watch the city unfold before them. The streets were alive with the usual energy of Los Angeles, fast-paced, indifferent, yet somehow magnetic. Tourists pointed at maps, trying to navigate their way through the urban sprawl, while locals maneuvered effortlessly through the throng, accustomed to the chaos. Emerging from a quiet corner cafe, Ulysses' Coffee House, Will Smith adjusted the brim of his baseball cap, tugging it a little lower over his forehead. He had always appreciated the anonymity that Los Angeles granted to celebrities when they weren't actively seeking attention. Here, in the midst of the evening crowd, he was just another person moving through the city, a shadow among millions. The cafe had been a perfect refuge for a brief moment of solitude. He had spent the last hour nursing a latte, lost in thought, barely checking his phone. He needed the quiet. The past few months had been a whirlwind, press tours, meetings, projects that seemed never-ending, and while he was grateful for his career, for the success, sometimes he just needed a pause. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket and started walking. His sneakers moved soundlessly over the pavement, weaving through the pedestrian traffic. He let his gaze wander, taking in the world around him, the glow of streetlights reflecting off damp pavement, the smell of a taco truck sizzling up the block, the distant wail of a siren cutting through the night. It was moments like this that reminded him why he loved this city. No matter how big it was, no matter how many people passed by, every street, every block, every person had a story. Some were written in their hurried steps, in the way they clutched their phones, in the laughter shared between friends. Others were quieter, unnoticed, waiting to be told. He turned a corner and slowed his pace as something unusual caught his eye. Across the street, set up on the edge of the sidewalk, was a small folding table. A single lamp clipped to the side illuminated the display, casting a soft yellow glow over the neatly arranged packages of what looked like homemade cookies. A handmade sign, written in uneven, slightly smudged black marker, was taped to the front of the table. Selling cookies for chemotherapy. The words stopped him cold. Behind the table stood a young girl, no older than 11 or 12. She was small, with delicate features and pale skin that seemed to glow under the lamplight. Her hair was short, unevenly cut, likely the result of a recent round of chemotherapy. There was a tiredness in her stance, in the way she leaned slightly against the table, yet her eyes remained bright. She smiled at each passerby, her lips curving in a way that seemed almost practiced, as if she had been standing there for hours, forcing hope into her expression. For a moment, Will just watched. He saw the way people passed by, some sparing the table a glance before looking away, others slowing for a second, reading the sign, their expressions flickering with hesitation before continuing on. A few gave her pitying smiles, but no one stopped. The girl didn't falter. She adjusted the placement of the cookie packages, ensuring they were lined up just right. Every few minutes, she straightened the sign, making sure it was visible to the crowd. She never called out to anyone, never begged for attention. She simply waited, offering a quiet presence in the midst of the moving city. A woman in a business suit paused, seemingly considering buying something. She hesitated, then shook her head, offering the girl a small, apologetic smile before walking away. A man in a hoodie walked by, barely giving the table a glance. A couple strolled past, laughing softly, lost in their own conversation. No one stopped. Will's gaze lingered on the girl's hands. Small fingers gripped the edge of the table, steadying herself. She looked fine at first glance, but he noticed the slight tremble in her hands, the exhaustion in her posture, the way she subtly shifted her weight from foot to foot, as if standing for too long was difficult. His throat tightened. How long had she been out here? How many nights had she spent hoping that someone would care enough to help? The reality of it was cruel. Not just the illness, but the sheer indifference of the world. People saw her, but they kept walking. They noticed, but they did nothing. He knew that feeling. It was the same helplessness he had felt years ago when he sat in a hospital waiting room, staring at the clock, knowing that no amount of fame, no amount of money could stop what was happening to the person he loved. He swallowed hard, exhaling slowly. The girl hadn't noticed him yet. She was still focused on the crowd, scanning the faces for someone, anyone, who might stop. Will glanced at the cookie packages on the table again. The care she had put into them was evident. Each bag carefully sealed, a little sticker placed on top, likely a handwritten thank you note inside. It wasn't just about selling cookies. She was fighting for her life. And for the first time in a long time, Will found himself standing at a crossroads he hadn't expected. He could walk away, blend back into the city, let this moment pass like every other fleeting second in Los Angeles. Or he could do something that mattered. He took a slow breath. Then, making up his mind, he stepped forward. Will stepped off the curb and crossed the street, moving toward the small folding table where the girl stood. As he neared, the details of the scene became sharper. The faint scuff marks on the table's surface, the way the street lamp cast a soft glow over the girl's neatly arranged packages, the slight way her shoulders sagged when no one was looking. She was focused on the passing crowd, scanning each face with quiet hope, though it was clear she had grown accustomed to disappointment. Every time someone slowed, she straightened up slightly, but when they walked away, she simply let out a small breath and adjusted the placement of her goods as if the failure didn't sting. Will paused a few steps away, watching her for a moment longer. She was young, maybe 11, 12 at most, but something about the way she carried herself felt older. There was a weariness in her movements, something careful, deliberate, as if she was holding herself together with sheer determination. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted one of the cookie packages, though she quickly curled her fingers into fists to steady them. He saw it. The exhaustion, the quiet fight. She was sick. There was no denying it. The uneven cut of her hair, the slight hollowness beneath her eyes, the thinness of her arms despite the oversized sweater she wore. Yet she stood there with purpose, not as someone asking for pity, but as someone offering something. Her work, her effort, a piece of herself in exchange for the hope that someone might help her keep fighting. A mother and daughter passed by, the younger girl glancing at the cookies with curiosity. The mother gave a polite but dismissive nod before leading her away. An older man slowed, read the sign, then exhaled deeply and shook his head before walking on. A group of teenagers walked past without even noticing her. Will's jaw tightened. She had likely been standing here for hours, selling something as small and simple as homemade cookies in the hopes of affording something as monumental as chemotherapy. And the world just kept walking past her. He took a step forward. The girl noticed him now. Her eyes flicked up, and for the briefest moment, there was a spark of hope before she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than he expected. Will looked down at the table, pretending to examine the cookies while his mind worked through what he was feeling. Each package was carefully wrapped, tied with a ribbon. Some had little hand-drawn labels, colorful stars and hearts decorating the plastic wrap. This wasn't just some rushed attempt to make money. She had put time into this. He reached out, picking up a package at random. The cookies inside were golden brown with little flecks of chocolate and what looked like walnuts. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifted faintly through the cool evening air. It was homemade, real, personal. The girl watched him carefully, waiting. Her expression remained composed, but Will could see the tension in her hands, the way her fingers curled slightly against the table's edge. She was bracing herself for another rejection. He looked down at the sign again. Selling cookies for chemotherapy. It was written in childish, uneven handwriting, some of the letters a little smudged, as if she had taken extra time making sure it was readable. His grip tightened slightly around the cookie package. She was a kid. She should have been at home, watching cartoons, playing games, doing anything but this. Instead, she was here, on a cold sidewalk in a city that never slowed down, selling cookies because the cost of staying alive was more than her family could handle. Will exhaled slowly. He had been here before. Not on the street, not selling something to stay alive, but he had been in a hospital waiting room, pacing, running through numbers in his head, wondering if any amount of money could ever be enough. He had watched someone he loved fight this same battle, and he had felt that helplessness, that desperate need to do something, anything, to take away the burden, to buy time, to stop the world from taking away something it had no right to take. His fingers loosened slightly around the package as he lifted his gaze back to the girl. She was still watching him, cautious but hopeful. A small breeze swept through the street, rustling the corner of the sign, making the plastic wrap around the cookies crinkle softly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Will reached into his pocket. Not for his wallet. Not yet. He took a breath. This wasn't just about buying a cookie. It was about something bigger. It was about recognition, about someone finally seeing her. And for the first time in hours, maybe in days, the girl wasn't invisible anymore. The moment stretched between them, quiet and charged, as the city continued moving around them. The girl still stood behind her small folding table, watching him with quiet patience, though there was something else in her gaze now, something fragile, like a flickering ember waiting for a gust of wind to either extinguish it or set it ablaze. Will held the package of cookies in his hands, the plastic crinkling slightly under his fingers. The weight of the moment settled over him, pressing against his chest in a way he hadn't expected. He had stopped because he saw her, really saw her, in a way no one else had bothered to. But now that he was standing here, looking at her, thin, tired but determined, something deep inside him was stirring. A memory, uninvited but vivid, pushed its way to the surface. It had been a hospital room. The sterile white walls, the cold, artificial lighting, the faint but ever-present smell of antiseptic that clung to the air. Machines beeped softly in the background, steady but unyielding. The sheets on the bed had been crisp and clean, but no amount of tidiness could make the space feel comfortable. It was a place of waiting, of uncertainty, of fear. And in the center of it all had been Jada, his wife, his rock, the woman who had faced the world with a strength that had always left him in awe. She had been lying in that bed, her head resting against the stiff pillow, her skin paler than it should have been, but her eyes, those deep, fierce eyes, had still burned with the same fire, the same unshakable will. She had smiled at him that day, not the big, charismatic smile that she wore in front of cameras, nor the teasing smirk she gave when she playfully argued with him about something trivial. It had been a different kind of smile, a quiet one, a strong one, a tired one. He had sat beside her, his hands wrapped around hers, their fingers intertwined. He had held on too tightly, as if sheer force could anchor her to the world, as if holding on hard enough would stop time from slipping through his fingers. She had laughed softly, squeezing his hand in return. "You look like you're about to fight somebody," she had teased. But the truth was, he had wanted to. He had wanted to punch something, scream, break something, fight the universe itself for putting her in that bed. Money hadn't mattered. Fame hadn't mattered. None of it had been enough to stop what was happening to her. And that helplessness, the knowledge that no amount of power or wealth could protect the person he loved most, had nearly destroyed him. The memory hit him with full force as he stood on that sidewalk holding a bag of cookies, staring at a little girl who was fighting that same fight. She was alone in a way that only someone who had been through it could understand. She was standing here, selling cookies to stay alive, because the world had told her, in its cruel and indifferent way, that survival came with a price tag. And now, looking at her, thin arms, shaky hands, that same fire in her eyes, he felt it all over again. That helplessness, that rage, that desperate, clawing need to do something. His fingers tightened around the package. The city buzzed around them, oblivious. Cars sped past, their headlights streaking through the evening air. People moved, their lives continuing as usual, unaware of the battle happening right here, at this small table on the sidewalk. But Will was aware, and he couldn't just walk away. He exhaled, forcing himself to push back the weight in his chest. The past was the past. Jada had fought, she had endured, and she was still here. But he remembered the cost. The emotional toll, the late nights, the endless worries about treatments, about medical bills, about whether the next procedure would be the one to finally make a difference. And now, standing in front of this little girl, he saw that same story unfolding all over again. Only this time, he could do something about it. His hand went to his pocket. Not just for his wallet, but because he was about to make a choice. Not to watch, not to sympathize, but to act. Will stood there, gripping the small package of cookies, his fingers tightening around the plastic wrapping as though anchoring himself to the present. The air around him seemed heavier now, thick with memories, with thoughts he hadn't invited but couldn't push away. The city noise faded, its hum dissolving into the background like a muffled radio signal. The girl in front of him shifted her weight slightly, her small hands resting on the edge of the folding table as she watched him with quiet patience. She didn't press him to buy. She didn't speak at all. She just stood there, waiting, the same way she had been all evening, scanning each face that passed by, hoping, but never begging. It wasn't just the sickness that weighed on her. It was the knowledge that the world kept moving while she stood still, trying to fight a battle that others could ignore. That was what got to him the most. Not just the illness, not just the fragility in her frame, but the way people walked past as though she weren't even there. Like she was part of the scenery, a fleeting detail in the blur of their daily lives. She had accepted it, he realized. Accepted that most people would glance at her, read the sign, hesitate for half a second before shaking their heads and walking away. The thought made his stomach tighten. He had been there. Not on the sidewalk, not with a table full of cookies, but in that space between hope and despair. That raw place where you knew help was possible, but it depended entirely on the kindness of strangers. He had watched Jada fight for her life, had watched doctors talk about survival in percentages, as if his wife's life could be reduced to a mathematical equation. He had felt the frustration of knowing that even with his money, his success, his resources, it had still been a battle. And this girl, this little kid, was fighting alone, with nothing but her cookies and her cardboard sign. He exhaled slowly. He couldn't walk away. The decision wasn't dramatic, wasn't filled with a grand realization or sudden epiphany. It was quiet, simple, inevitable. He couldn't be like the others. He couldn't be another passing shadow in her evening of disappointments. His feet moved forward before he could second-guess himself, closing the small distance between them. The girl noticed immediately. Her shoulders straightened slightly, though her face remained neutral, the cautious hope still lingering in her eyes. She didn't smile too quickly, didn't look too eager. She had likely learned through experience that some people stopped only to ask questions, to offer pity, to say things like, "I wish I could help," before walking away. Will glanced down at the cookies again, not because he needed to, but because he needed a second to compose himself. There was something deeply wrong about this, about a child being forced to do this at all. "How much?" he asked finally, his voice low, steady. She blinked at him as if the sound of his voice surprised her, but then she answered, her tone polite, rehearsed. She had said these words many times today, and it was clear she no longer expected much from him. $5. $5. $5 for a small bag of cookies that likely took hours to bake and package. $5 that, in reality, was nothing compared to what she needed. $5 for a chance, a slim, painful, gut-wrenching chance to buy herself more time. Will reached into his pocket. His fingers found his wallet and he pulled it out, flipping it open with one practiced motion. His gaze flicked to the bills tucked inside, but he already knew what he was going to do. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He didn't take out a 5, or a 10, or a 20. Instead, he pulled out a thick stack of bills, folded neatly, crisp from the bank. It was more than a few hundred. It was thousands. He had taken out cash earlier that day for something else, something trivial that now felt utterly meaningless. He placed the entire stack on the table. The girl didn't react at first. She just stared at it, then up at him, then back at the money, her fingers frozen mid-motion as if she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to touch it. Her breath caught. "That should cover a few cookies," Will said lightly, but his voice wasn't teasing. It wasn't casual. It was quiet, serious. The girl's lips parted, but no words came out. Her hands trembled slightly, hovering over the money like she expected it to disappear the moment she reached for it. A few passers-by noticed what was happening. A woman slowed her steps, her gaze flicking between the girl, the money, and Will. A man in a suit who had walked past just minutes ago without a second glance, suddenly turned around, curiosity in his eyes. The girl finally moved. Her fingers, thin and pale, carefully closed around the stack, as if afraid it might vanish if she wasn't gentle. Her breath hitched again. She wasn't crying, but Will could see the effort it took to hold herself together. Her eyes flicked up to his. He saw everything in that look, the disbelief, the gratitude, the desperate, aching relief of someone who had been fighting alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone step in and say, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She swallowed hard, her small hands tightening around the money. She started, but her voice cracked. She pressed her lips together, trying again. "I don't." Will shook his head. "It's okay," he said, and he meant it. He saw it then, the way her fingers curled around the money like it was life itself, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly, as if some of the weight had finally lifted. The man in the suit stepped closer. "Wait," he said slowly, frowning. "Did he just—" Another woman stopped beside him. "He gave her all that?" she murmured. A teenage boy, walking past with his friends, turned his head at the conversation and slowed down, his gaze darting toward the girl and then Will. "What's going on?" And just like that, the moment grew. More people noticed. More people turned. And suddenly, what had been a quiet, overlooked struggle was no longer something the world could ignore. Will stepped back, watching as the small table that had gone unnoticed for hours was now drawing attention. People were talking, whispering, pulling out their phones, snapping pictures. Someone else reached for a bag of cookies. And then another. And another. The girl looked around, wide-eyed, as the momentum shifted, as people, real people, strangers, started to care. Will met her gaze one last time, offering her a small, steady nod before he turned and walked away, because he didn't need to stay to know what was about to happen. For the first time all evening, maybe even longer than that, she wasn't invisible anymore. The girl's hands remained frozen around the thick stack of bills, her fingers curled tightly as though the weight of them might slip through if she wasn't careful. Her breath was unsteady, her chest rising and falling in shallow, disbelieving gasps. The world around her had not yet caught up with what had just happened. The cars still moved down the street, their headlights sweeping across the pavement. Conversations still hummed in the background, punctuated by laughter, by ringing phones, by the sharp clicks of high heels against concrete. But, for her, time had come to a standstill. She lifted her gaze to Will again, as if expecting to find some clue in his face that would explain why a stranger, a man she had never met before, had done something so utterly incomprehensible. People didn't just give away that much money. They didn't stop in the middle of their evening, in the middle of their own lives, to change someone else's. Her lips parted, but no words came. The amount was too much to believe, too much to make sense of. It wasn't $5. It wasn't 20. It wasn't even 100. It was thousands. Thousands of dollars resting in her small hands, pressing against her palms with a significance that felt impossible to process. A voice somewhere in the growing crowd murmured, "Did he just—" Another followed. "Wait, how much did he give her?" A woman, holding a grocery bag, stopped mid-step, her brow furrowing as she tried to piece together the scene. "That's gotta be a mistake," she said to no one in particular. The murmurs grew. Will could feel the shift happening, the slow realization rippling outward like a pebble dropped into still water. More people were stopping now, their attention snapping toward the girl and the modest table she had been standing behind unnoticed for hours. The man in the suit who had ignored her earlier was now staring openly. He wasn't the only one. A group of young women paused, their eyes darting between the table, the money, and Will. Someone pulled out a phone, raising it hesitantly, as if unsure whether to take a picture or not. Will watched the girl closely, his own breath steady but measured. He had seen shock before. He had felt it himself in a hospital room years ago, when a doctor had uttered words he hadn't been ready to hear. That same hollowness, that same moment of disconnection was written all over her small face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She was frozen. Not in the way people freeze when they win the lottery or when they're handed an unexpected gift. This was something deeper, a kind of disbelief that came from being so accustomed to struggle that the mere idea of help felt unreal. She had braced herself for rejection all night, for people to look, to hesitate, to walk away. She had not braced herself for this, for someone to see her, truly see her, and change everything in a single instant. Her fingers twitched against the stack of money, her body betraying the overwhelming surge of emotion she was fighting to contain. Will knew that feeling, knew what it was like to want to accept something but be terrified that it would disappear if you let yourself believe in it. And then, finally, she spoke. It was barely a whisper, a breath more than a voice. I don't understand. Will didn't answer right away, because he knew there was no explanation she would fully accept, not yet. The world had taught her that nothing came easily, that every dollar, every ounce of effort had to be earned in a way that took something from you. But this was freely given. And that was what made it unbelievable. One of the bystanders, a man in his 50s wearing a windbreaker, took a hesitant step forward. He pointed toward the thick stack of bills still clutched in the girl's hands. "Is that real?" he asked cautiously. The girl looked down at the money, as if seeing it for the first time all over again. She swallowed hard. Will saw it happen, the slow unraveling of the tightly controlled composure she had held on to for hours, maybe even months. The reality was sinking in. Not just that someone had helped, but that for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to do this alone. Her lips pressed together. Her grip tightened, not out of hesitation, but out of fear that it wasn't real. Because how many times had she wished for this? How many nights had she spent wondering how much longer her family could afford to keep fighting? How many days had she woken up knowing that the bills were piling up faster than the money could come in? This money wasn't just money. It was hope. It was time. It was a future she wasn't sure she would have had yesterday. The emotions in her eyes were raw, unguarded, a storm of disbelief, gratitude, and something else, something she was afraid to feel. Relief. The moment stretched. Someone else in the crowd stirred, a young woman with a scarf wrapped around her shoulders. She glanced at Will, then at the girl, and then did something no one had done all evening. She reached into her own purse and pulled out her wallet. "How much are they?" she asked softly. The girl's head jerked up. She blinked, still overwhelmed, still struggling to catch up with what was happening. The woman smiled gently. "The cookies," she clarified, nodding toward the neatly wrapped bags. "How much?" It took a second for the girl to remember. "5," she whispered. Then she cleared her throat, her voice stronger this time. $5. The woman pulled out a 20 and set it on the table. "Keep the change," she said, and just like that, the dam broke. A man stepped forward. "I'll take a bag, too." "I want one," said another voice, then another, and another. And suddenly, what had once been a quiet, overlooked corner of the street was a flurry of movement. Hands reaching for cookies. Bills being placed on the table. Will took a step back, watching as the moment spread like wildfire. Because this wasn't just about what he had done anymore. It was about the fact that people were finally seeing her. That, in a city where millions walked past each other without a second thought, tonight they had stopped. The girl stared at the growing crowd, her expression shifting from shock to something else, something that looked a lot like hope. Her hands no longer trembled in fear, they trembled in awe. And for the first time all night, Will saw it. The slightest, barely there smile. Not one of politeness, not one of obligation, but one of real, genuine belief. Because tonight, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone anymore. The world had changed around her in the span of minutes. Where there had been indifference, there was now motion. Where there had been silence, there was now a hum of voices, of transactions, of hands reaching across the folding table, exchanging money for small bags of cookies that had sat untouched for hours. The sign, which had once been ignored, now stood like a banner, like a beacon that no one could look past anymore. The girl stood frozen for a moment, her small fingers still curled around the thick stack of bills that Will had placed in her hands. Her mind was struggling to catch up with what was happening. Just minutes ago, she had been invisible, standing alone against the tide of the city, watching people glance at her with brief flickers of sympathy before walking on. She had learned to expect it. She had learned to endure it. But now, everything had shifted. Now, people were stopping. Now, they were seeing her. Will stood slightly back from the growing crowd, watching as the girl tried to keep up with the sudden surge of buyers. The first woman who had approached her, the one wrapped in a scarf, smiled as she tucked her cookies into her bag. "Good luck, sweetheart," she murmured before stepping aside to let the next person through. The girl nodded mutely, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she just took the next bill that was offered to her, her hands moving automatically, her mind still struggling to process what was unfolding. A businessman, still in his neatly pressed suit from a long day at the office, pulled out his wallet. He had been one of the many who had walked past earlier, his attention consumed by something on his phone. But now, he was here. Now, he was offering far more than $5. "Take this," he said simply, handing over a folded 100. The girl hesitated, staring at the money, her throat working as she tried to form words. "Keep it," the man said, cutting off whatever protest might have followed. Then, in a softer voice, almost as if he wasn't sure how to express it, he added, "You're stronger than most people I know." And then he was gone, disappearing back into the crowd. More people stepped forward. A young couple, a man in a baseball cap, a mother with her son who looked no older than the girl herself. The boy watched her intently as his mother bought 2 bags of cookies, his small hands gripping the edge of her coat. He didn't say anything, but his eyes never left her, as if trying to understand what it meant to be standing there, selling something so simple for something so necessary. The girl barely noticed the money piling up in the small cash box she had brought. She barely noticed how light her table was becoming, how the carefully arranged stacks of cookies were vanishing, one by one, into the hands of strangers. She barely noticed any of it, because the weight of what was happening was pressing against her in a way that was deeper than just money, deeper than just sales. It was the way people were looking at her now. Not with pity. Not with that hesitant, sympathetic glance that said, "I feel bad, but I can't help you." No. They were looking at her with recognition, with the understanding that she was more than just a girl with an illness, more than just a charity case standing on the sidewalk hoping for kindness. She was fighting, and they respected that. A lump formed in her throat. Her fingers clenched slightly around the stack of bills Will had given her, but she couldn't make herself put them down. She kept holding them as if letting go would break the fragile reality of what was happening. And then she looked at him. Will. He hadn't moved much since handing her the money, standing just outside the growing cluster of people, his hands still in his pockets, his gaze steady and unreadable. He wasn't taking credit for what had happened. He wasn't stepping forward, making himself the center of attention. He had done something, and then he had let the world take over. She stared at him, her breath shaky, unsure of what to say, unsure of whether she could say anything at all. Will understood. She didn't have to speak. She didn't have to say thank you, didn't have to stumble over words that wouldn't be big enough to express the weight of what he had done. Instead, he just nodded, a small, quiet movement, a confirmation, a message without words. "It's okay. I see you. I know what this means to you." And that was enough. She let out a slow, trembling breath, and then, finally, she let go of the money, placing it carefully into the cash box, her fingers lingering on the bills as if committing them to memory before she closed the lid. By the time Will finally took a step back, the scene had changed completely. The table, which had been untouched for so long, was almost empty now. Only a few remaining packages of cookies sat on the surface, and they wouldn't last much longer. The girl was still busy, still handing out bags, still taking money from hands that kept reaching forward. But something was different. The weight that had pressed against her shoulders when Will had first seen her, the exhaustion, the quiet resignation, wasn't there anymore. She wasn't standing with the same fragile uncertainty as before. She was standing taller now, more sure of herself, more steady. Will exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside him. He had seen this kind of strength before. He had seen it in Jada, in the way she had faced her own battle, in the way she had refused to let the world define her by her illness. And now he had seen it here, in a little girl selling cookies on the sidewalk. A little girl who, for the first time in a long time, had been reminded that she wasn't alone. As he turned and walked away, the voices behind him blurred into the fabric of the city, the quiet hum of traffic, the occasional burst of laughter, the rustling of footsteps on pavement. But through it all, he could still hear her, still hear the murmur of her voice as she spoke to the next person who stepped forward, still hear the sound of hope in the way she answered them, still hear the soft crinkle of plastic as she handed over another bag, another piece of herself, another moment that, just an hour ago, had seemed impossible. Will didn't look back. He didn't have to, because he knew. Somewhere behind him, on a quiet street corner in Los Angeles, a little girl was standing stronger than before, and that was enough. Will walked down the sidewalk, slipping back into the current of people moving through the city. The sounds of traffic, of footsteps, of distant music from a street performer blended into the familiar hum of Los Angeles. But something had shifted. Not just for the girl, not just for the people who had stopped at her table, but for him. He had come out tonight looking for nothing in particular. Just a walk, just a quiet moment in the city he had called home for so many years. And yet, without intending to, he had stepped into something much bigger. He had seen something unjust, something wrong, and he had changed it. Not through grand speeches or publicity, but by doing the simplest, most human thing. He had helped. And now, as he glanced back over his shoulder, he saw the ripples spreading outward. The girl was no longer alone behind her folding table. A crowd had gathered. Not a swarm of people, not a chaotic rush, but something steadier, more organic. A growing presence of individuals who had been drawn in, first by curiosity, then by recognition, then by the undeniable pull of a story unfolding in front of them. It was no longer just about a man giving money to a sick child. It was about what happened next. A young woman, her blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail, stepped forward and pulled a bill from her purse. Not a $5 bill, but a $50. She placed it on the table and took a bag of cookies, her eyes soft with something deeper than casual charity. Right behind her, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a leather jacket, crossed his arms as he watched the exchange. He had the look of someone who had come over just to see what was going on, but now found himself standing still, unable to look away. Slowly, he reached into his back pocket, took out his wallet, and handed over a crisp $100 bill. "Keep it," he said simply, before turning and walking away without taking anything in return. The girl's hands trembled as she picked up the bill and placed it carefully into the growing pile in her cash box. Her eyes flicked up, scanning the crowd, trying to understand what was happening, why it was happening, as if she didn't quite trust that this moment was real. And then, as if something had finally clicked into place, she took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice still small, still uncertain, but no longer fragile. The woman with the ponytail smiled. "Don't thank me," she said, "just keep going." The girl nodded, swallowing hard, and kept going. She handed out another bag, then another, and another. The pace picked up. A teenager in a hoodie, maybe 16 or 17, elbowed his friend. "Dude, we should buy some." His friend scoffed. "Since when do you eat cookies?" The teenager shrugged but stepped forward anyway, pulling out his wallet. "It's not about the cookies, man." And just like that, they were in too. Will lingered at a distance, watching, listening. It wasn't just people buying cookies anymore. It was conversation starting. It was strangers connecting. It was an unspoken agreement that, for once, no one was going to just walk past this. An older man leaned down and asked the girl, "How long have you been out here?" Her hands, now steadier, stacked another row of bills inside the cash box before she answered. "Since 3. 3? The man's brow furrowed. He looked at his watch. It was almost 9. The realization settled over those within earshot. 6 hours. She had stood here 6 hours, trying, hoping, waiting, and for most of those hours she'd been invisible. The man exhaled sharply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another $50. "That's for your time," he said. The girl hesitated but took it. This time, she didn't look surprised. This time, she just nodded. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "Someone should call the news." The words lingered, hanging in the air like an idea waiting to be claimed. And then, from the back of the growing cluster of people, a new voice called out, "I'm a journalist." Heads turned. A young woman, mid-20s, dark curls falling past her shoulders, stepped forward, a press badge clipped to the front of her denim jacket. She pulled out her phone, lifting it slightly, as if waiting for permission. "Would you mind if I—" She gestured toward the girl, toward the table, toward the moment that was unfolding before them. The girl blinked, as if struggling to believe this was really happening. But then she nodded, and the journalist lifted her phone and started recording. Will watched as she adjusted the focus, taking in the handwritten sign, the nearly empty table, the way the cash box was now stuffed full. "This is incredible," the journalist murmured. She glanced up at the girl, eyes warm but serious. "Can I ask your name?" For a brief second, hesitation flickered in the girl's expression. Then she stood straighter, took a breath, and answered, "Sophie." Sophie. She'd been just a girl on a sidewalk hours ago. Now she had a name. Now she had a story. Will exhaled, feeling something settle deep inside him. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't set out to create a moment that would spread beyond himself. But that was the thing about choosing to act. You never knew what might come of it. One action, one small moment of choosing to see someone instead of walking past them. And now, here she was, standing taller than before, telling the world her name. The journalist continued filming as people kept buying, kept giving. And Will? Will knew what came next. This wouldn't stop here. By the morning, people across the city, maybe even beyond, would hear about a little girl named Sophie, who had stood on a sidewalk for hours, hoping someone would see her. And they would see her. Because now, she wasn't invisible anymore. Now, the whole world was watching. By the time Sophie packed up her stand, the world around her had changed. The last few bags of cookies had been bought in a rush, not just because of their taste, but because people wanted to be part of something real, something that mattered. Strangers had handed over money, some of them not even bothering to take a bag, just pressing bills into her hands with murmured words of encouragement. Some had told her their own stories, about loved ones who had fought the same battle she was fighting, about how they understood, how they wished they had done more when they had the chance. The journalist had stayed, asking careful, gentle questions, making sure Sophie was comfortable before turning her phone's camera on. And Sophie, despite the whirlwind of emotions, had stood tall, had answered, had told her name to the world. Now the street had quieted. The crowd had begun to disperse, people drifting back into the rhythm of their evening, though some still lingered, reluctant to let the moment end. The journalist was typing quickly on her phone, no doubt preparing to send out the story as soon as she could. The light from the street lamp overhead flickered slightly, casting a golden hue over the nearly empty table. Sophie stared at it. A few hours ago it had been full. A few hours ago she had been counting how many cookies she had left, calculating how much more she needed to sell to even make a dent in the cost of her next treatment. And now the money sat inside her small cash box, overflowing with bills she never thought she would see in her life. Enough. More than enough. Her fingers traced the edge of the box. She wasn't used to this feeling. She wasn't used to winning. She wasn't used to waking up in the morning without feeling like she was running out of time. A part of her still didn't quite believe it. What if this was a dream? What if she woke up tomorrow and found herself back in the same spot with the same untouched cookies, the same blank faces walking by? But it wasn't a dream. She could feel the cash beneath her fingertips. She could see the receipts still folded next to the nearly empty cookie trays. She could hear the distant sounds of cars, of footsteps, of life moving forward. And when she looked up, she saw Will. He was still standing nearby, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same quiet intensity he had had all night. He hadn't stepped forward when the crowd had gathered, hadn't pulled attention toward himself. He had simply done what needed to be done and let her take it from there. And now, as their eyes met, she felt something in her chest tighten. She didn't know how to say what she was feeling. How could she? How could she possibly put into words what he had done for her? She had expected tonight to be like all the others. She had expected rejection, disappointment, exhaustion. Instead, he had changed everything, and not just because of the money, because he had seen her, because he had made others see her too. She swallowed hard, feeling her hands clench slightly around the edge of the table. He nodded at her just once, as if he understood, and she nodded back. No words needed. A moment later, Will took a slow step backward, then turned and started walking down the street. She watched him go, his figure blending into the night, his presence disappearing into the flow of the city once more. And yet, she knew. She would never forget this night, and neither would anyone else. The next morning, Sophie woke to her phone buzzing non-stop. For a moment, she thought it was her alarm, until she reached for it and saw the notifications. Hundreds of them, messages, mentions, comments. Her stomach tightened as she swiped at the screen, her breath catching as she saw the first words that popped up. A little girl fights for her life on a street corner, and Los Angeles listens. Her hands trembled as she opened the article. It had been posted hours ago while she was still sleeping. The journalist had written it beautifully, capturing everything, her name, her story, the hours she had spent standing there, hoping, waiting. And of course, it mentioned Will. It didn't make him the center of the story, but it didn't ignore what he had done either. It described the moment he had stepped forward, the way the crowd had shifted after that, the way people had begun to notice her, not as a charity case, not as a sick girl begging for help, but as a fighter. Her heart pounded. The article had been shared thousands of times. The video the journalist had taken had gone viral overnight. People were commenting, donating, asking how they could help. And then, her eyes widened. An email from a gallery. She clicked it open, barely breathing. The owner of a prestigious art gallery in New York had seen the story, had seen her artwork in the background of some of the photos that had been taken. They wanted to showcase her work. Sophie stared at the screen, the words blurring as something hot pressed against her eyes. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was a future. This was something beyond survival. She had spent so long thinking only about getting through the next treatment, the next appointment, the next hurdle. Now she could think about something else. Now she could think about living. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat pounding against her palm. Hope. That was what this feeling was. It had been so long since she had let herself feel it. She exhaled shakily and looked back at her phone. A new notification had popped up. A text from an unknown number. Her fingers hesitated before she tapped it open. Just a few words. Your fight reminds me why some stories still matter. Never stop telling yours. Will. She closed her eyes, let out a breath, and for the first time in a long, long time, she smiled, because for the first time in forever, she wasn't just fighting to survive. She was fighting for something more, for a life she could actually live. And that changed everything. Subscribe for more stories like this, and don't miss what's coming next. Watch our other videos to see more incredible moments unfold. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to see it.